Hello, jewelry lover. My name is Bella Naiman, and I'm the founder of New York City Jewelry Week. Welcome to this virtual program, part of NYC JW 24. The theme for the seventh annual edition is Wander and Wander, and it reflects the multifaceted nature of jewelry as both art and personal expression. Wander captures the awe inspiring craftsmanship behind each piece, the dazzling, delicate, or bold details that turn your head in admiration. Wander invites you to explore the wonderful and wild creative journeys behind the jewelry. It's not just about the finished piece, it's about the adventure it took to get there. Designers experiment, push boundaries, and play with ideas and materials. And this year, New York City Jewelry Week takes participants to see it all unfold. Every necklace, ring, and bracelet is a passport to a new world where innovation reigns and imagination knows no limit. So we hope that these programs will take you on that journey and are your passport as well. Sit back, enjoy, and while these are not live, we welcome your comments. So please don't hesitate to drop us a line, whether it's email or Instagram, or even get in touch with some of the incredible curators, artists, writers that have really worked very hard to bring you this program. So thanks very much. And we also hope to see you out in New York. Bye.
Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to present on behalf of the Enameled Society. My name is Patricia Nelson, and I'm president of the Enameled Society. We feel that New York Jewelry Week is a perfect event where we can show the jewelry world what a terrific, inclusive, and welcoming group we are. I'd like to take you on a journey through the rich history of mourning and sentimental jewelry. The project was begun by Enameled Society board member Barbara McFadyen, who marked the first anniversary of her mother's death while she was in graduate school in 2014. Having lost her first husband and sister, she began exploring and making memorial jewelry as a way to cope with her sadness. This quest led her to research the world of mourning and sentimental jewelry, especially the exquisite work of the Georgian and Victorian periods. I have added the work of some contemporary jewelers as well to illustrate the timeliness of these concerns. Death and dying is certainly still with us, and we need ways to acknowledge our losses by ceremonies and certainly by objects, the beautiful and intimate objects that only jewelry can become. This sad little image shows the ubiquitous nature of death as it was experienced by the rich and poor throughout time, only lessening its impact somewhat in the 20th century, somewhat. For example, Queen Anne of Great Britain had 17 pregnancies, 12 stillbirths, and one child survived infancy, only to die at 11 years old. Very depressing statistics, but not atypical of the time. Death was always with us, and people from all ages experienced death of loved ones kind of on a regular basis. These are early forms of memento mori and death head jewelry. Memento mori, of course, means remember you must die in Latin. These pieces acknowledge the inevitability of death and reminded the wearers of their own mortality. Again, life was short, with the average lifespan of about 40 years. Skulls, crossbones, and cadavers were common images of mortality, reminding viewers of the fragility of life. I'd like to take a minute to look at that beautiful grisaille enamel in the center of that skull ring. Again, the work was beautiful. It was gold. It was gloriously done, but a little bit macabre in the subject matter, because again, the idea that we were here only for a temporary period of time and our real mission was the great beyond was so important during these times when life expectancy was again quite short. These were some pieces from the Stuart era, the Stuart era, from 1603 to 1714. The Stuart era covered the reigns of James I and II, Charles I and II, through William and Mary and Queen Anne. In other words, the late 17th and early 18th century. This was the time of London fire, the plague, the Civil War, and the 30 Years' War. The era suffered great loss of life. The memento mori symbols were beginning to be used for jewelry that was not only meant to warn the individual of their own mortality, but now these pieces started to commemorate the death of specific individuals, as so many people sustained grievous losses in families. Interestingly, the turning point from worrying about one's own mortality to acknowledging the death of others, intimate friends and family, was probably the death of King Charles I. The King Charles I, the martyr who was beheaded by the Roundheads of the time, was a character that had a lot of there was a lot of sympathy for his and the royalist causes, and there were many people, the Cavaliers particularly, who secretly mourned him for many years and wore small bits of jewelry that commemorated his death. Here we come to the Georgian period a little bit later, and this was the time of the King George's. And again, this was the time of the American Revolution. The American Revolution was within this time. So it gives you some period of a historical context. The gruesome skulls of medieval and Stuart era work gave way to neoclassical miniature scenes painted with sepia and ivory. This period produced intricate and imaginative mourning jewelry with delicate scenes painted on milk glass or ivory. This was quite a change from the type of symbolism that came before. It was much more gentle and much more romantic. The naturalist backgrounds are meant to be reminiscent of an imaginary Garden of Eden. Obituary information for the individual was written on plinths or obelisks in Latin abbreviations. Georgian period silhouettes became popular in the mid-18th century. It became fashionable to wear portrait jewelry at the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. Typically, the artist would trace the shadow profile of a sitter, and this shadow profile became even more meaningful if the subject had died. These profile mourning pieces, usually rings or pendants on long chains, were more affordable. Many more people other than royalty wore these. They became much more common. The technology for enlarging or reducing silhouettes was was very well known by this time. So a sitter could have a portrait done, and that could be reduced down to a tiny image, and it could be encased in glass in a ring or a pendant. During the Georgian period, a large vocabulary of symbols developed, from flora to fauna, and including many specific objects. For example, a harp dispels evil spirits and acts as a bridge between heaven and earth. Angels pointing towards heaven are escorting the departed toward heaven. The weeping willow with its drooping branches appears to be bowing in grief. The cypress tree represents death, but also the hope of immortality. These pieces were rich in symbolism, these beautiful miniature paintings rich in symbolism that a great many people knew how to read at the time. The brooch on the left depicts a serpent, which symbolized rebirth, regeneration, and eternity. The heart represents love, mortality, and the center of the soul. The crown represents honor, glory, triumph, and immortality. These were produced in great numbers, with stereotypical and well-understood variations on symbols of grief, such as wistful maidens leaning on anchors, urns, or broken columns. This was almost a kind of a text, a visual text. Everybody understood the message and the information that was being conveyed in these beautiful little bits of jewelry. Here we come to the Victorian period. This was a period of grandiose sentimentality and devout mourning that occurred on a scale never seen before. Victorian period is generally divided into three periods. The Romantic period from 1837 to 1860 covered Queen Victoria's marriage and childbearing years. Queen Victoria was the towering figure in this period, and in her life and her experiences and the things she experienced in her life had a great meaning for people, unbelievably enough, all over the world. The Grand Style period from about 1860 to about 1885 was Victoria's period of intense mourning for Albert. During that time, early in that time, she lost her husband. Also, this was a period of great expansion for the British Empire. The last period in the Victorian era was the Romantic period, imaginative and delicate Art Nouveau, curls and curves that ended at about in the beginning of the 20th century. Generally, the Romantic period had the most imaginative and delicate pieces. Leaves, flowers, buds, bunches of grapes, and so forth were used, and hair work and jewelry at this time was at its height. The finest and probably the finest and most delicate pieces of Victorian jewelry were produced at this early time. There was lots of fine metal, gold, and diamonds for the wealthy. I think it's appropriate to take just a second to talk a bit about the importance of the British Empire. Why is the terminology I'm using mostly British and mostly refers to British kings and queens? Well, that was because this was a period of the ascendancy of the British Empire. The British Empire and its colonies were highly significant. The British Empire actually controlled about 25% of the world's population at the time, and British nomenclature and British fashions and British terminology had a huge impact on the rest of the world. Again, you can see how places like India and Australia and places all over the world were part of the British Empire, and therefore had a lot of British ways. And so those British ways and British terminology were the most important, I would say, in the world at this time. Here are a couple of photos. Here are a couple of Queen Victoria in her youth and in her old age. Although she was basically a figurehead, she certainly didn't have any power of life or death over her subjects like, say, Henry VIII did. She and her family symbolized what was upright and righteous in the British Empire. She symbolized the ideal family. Her manners, her mannerisms, her dress and opinions were widely copied, again, throughout the world, unbelievably enough. When her beloved husband, her beloved Prince Albert, died in 1861, after 21 years of marriage and 9 children, she went into an extended period of mourning that lasted for the rest of her life. While in that period of mourning, she set the style for dress and manners, especially regarding mourning. Mourning became a prolonged affair with specific clothing and jewelry for particular months and years of mourning. As you can see on the left, there were entire fashion magazines and catalogs devoted to mourning clothing, because practically every family had somebody that was in mourning for somebody at some time in their life. So your mourning wardrobe was part of your wardrobe, and you got it out when you needed to. A widow, for example, was expected to wear black for 1 year and subdued colors for another. And you mourned your distant relatives, your close relatives, your cousins, your aunts, of course, your children. So again, mourning clothes and mourning customs were extremely important during this period of time. The colors of mourning jewelry were very subdued: jet, obsidian, onyx, black and white enamel, with hair figuring prominently. Jet was one of the favored materials used in mourning jewelry. Queen Victoria found an outlet for her intense misery by commissioning jewelry to give in memory of her beloved Prince Albert. Jet is a type of lignite similar to coal. It comes from a wood that has been subjected to extreme pressure, and it is quite easy to carve. And even better, England had an abundance of jet. When she decreed that only jet was to be worn for her first year of mourning, this revived the English would-be jet industry, which had suffered due to a lot of competition from imitations from other countries. But when Queen Victoria said that jet was the most appropriate material for mourning jewelry, jet jewelry came into high prominence. And you can still find a number of jet pieces in antique stores and museums. It was very, very common. However, even in England, the jet supply ran out. So black glass, vulcanite, black lava, and onyx, black enamel were also used for mourning jewelry. Although again, jet was the preferred material. During the Grand Style period, about 1860 to 1885, jewelers reproduced ancient styles and designs rather than original themes. This bolder style was influenced by the discovery of the Etruscan, Greek, and Egyptian jewelry. This part of history was noted for lots of archaeological finds and digs. And again, when the British Empire ran or controlled a lot of the world, many examples of recently excavated work from the classical world would come to England at that time. It was a huge style. It was hugely popularized and very stylish to have an Etruscan brooch or a Roman brooch or something like that, that showed that you were up with contemporary thought. This jewelry tends to be large, well-made, and rather ponderous, and much has survived today. On the left is an IMO brooch, which stands for In Memory Of. It is in the Gothic Revival style, which had come into fashion thanks to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood of avant-garde artists. This brooch features delicate floral embellishments. Society was changing during this time. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and mass-produced jewelry became available. Once more, you can find examples of this quite large, very intricate neo-Gothic and neo-Etruscan examples of Victorian jewelry most commonly today. I would say from my experiences in many antique stores and museums, this is the kind that is mostly available. It was not just the royal family and court who wanted elaborate mourning jewelry. A vibrant industry was born, and that is partly that partly explains why there was such an abundance of this style and this type of jewelry made. Upon Victoria's death, the onset of the Edwardian period was much more fun and luxury loving. And after the Edwardian period came the onset of World War I and then the Roaring '20s. This kind of mourning that was popular in Victorian era became very impractical, very time-consuming, and the rigid rules of mourning began to disappear. And therefore, this type of jewelry disappeared rather rapidly, particularly at the onset of the 20th century. Hair jewelry was much loved during the Victorian period. And also before. You've seen a couple of examples of hair being incorporated in jewelry before the Victorian period. But it was the Victorian period that elevated this form of jewelry and this form of handwork to unprecedented heights. Hair is a wonderful thing, as a wonderful material to make jewelry with or to incorporate in jewelry. It does not degrade rapidly, and it's always had strong symbolic properties. You own a bit of that person in the hair, and the hair will stay that way pretty much forever. It's one's crowning glory, but it can be painlessly cut. And it stands in for the person in all sorts of ways. These metaphysical and symbolic properties of hair were not lost on Victorians. Journals and how-to manuals were written to teach the middle and lower classes how to make their own hair jewelry and decoration. Again, there's still a fair amount of this type of work available, and you can see great plaques for the wall and pieces of hair work framed in elaborate frames for the wall. However, it was certainly used a lot in jewelry. And here you can see examples of plaited hair in a brooch, woven hair in earrings, and on the top, the Alice brooch it did actually once belong to Queen Victoria. It was worn when she was in mourning for her second daughter, Alice. Her daughter, Alice, died of diphtheria quite young. And so Queen Victoria was in mourning for not only her husband, but also for her child. And this Alice brooch was almost perfect example of Victorian mourning jewelry. It had the symbolism, it had the diamonds, it had the crown, it had the hair and the little secret locket in the back, the black text. It was, again, a little essay in mourning jewelry. There's still quite an appreciation for mourning jewelry. Here's the work of some young jewelers working today in limited production jewelry. The bracelet on the left shows a piece done by an artist whose business, Hair Anthropology, will sell instructions and looms for making hair jewelry. So you can still find information for doing it, for using that wonderfully interesting and highly metaphorical material even today. And all of these young jewelers use these traditional forms and symbols for mourning jewelry. And again, we have become able to read what these mean. The urns, the willow, these things have become part of the vernacular. Art jewelers also work in hair. Here are two jewelers, Melanie Bylanker and Ty Carrington, who both use hair in a very contemporary way, not necessarily for mourning, but because of those symbolic and metaphysical and metaphorical associations that we have with hair. Melanie makes drawings with her hair. These line drawings illustrate average banal scenes from everyday life rendered in her own hair. Taisha Carrington celebrates the hair of Afro-American and Afro-Caribbean women. Different stories still using that material, hair, which is such a potent material. During the Victorian era, flowers gained special meaning and were used to send messages that etiquette demanded unacceptable to share openly. That meant that you could send a flower to somebody and it would have an enormous meaning, and you didn't have to actually say the words. Entire volumes were created to document the hundreds of meanings of flowers. This illustrated language of flowers was a dictionary of over 700 flowers and their meanings. It was enormously popular in England and all over Europe, and especially in the US. Roses were a particular favorite, with over 30 varieties used to convey different meanings and emotions. For example, the yellow rose signified friendship and caring, the white rose, purity and reverence, the pink rose was happiness, etc. Flower symbolism was and continues to be included in jewelry for its symbolic content. So not only did you have floral arrangements in your house, perhaps sent by somebody, perhaps a secret lover, and read the colors of those flowers and what they were for the message, but you also wore those same flowers in your jewelry, and those pieces, those flowers in your jewelry, also conveyed their own meaning. Here is an example of a perfect scene where flowers were being purchased for a kind of a secret message. Do you remember the scene from Martin Scorsese's The Age of Innocence when Newland Archer sends yellow roses to Ellen, the Countess, on whom he has a mad crush? He would never say that, but the roses that he sends says that very clearly. Say it with flowers, I believe, was an advertising slogan a few years ago, and it certainly has been true and continues to be a very powerful way of sending a message. Now we'll look at a particularly fascinating little group of jewelry pieces that started with a trend, went for about 60 years, and then the trend died out. But again, we still recognize and use the meaning in these little brooches, or this subject matter, which was the eye. The intimate vision of late 18th century eye miniatures is a unique genre in the history of portraiture, mourning, and sentimental jewelry. This was a short-lived phenomenon which spanned the years 1770 to about 1830. The first recorded eye miniatures appeared in 1773, and fewer than 1,000 from that classic period remain today, although the genre retains a fascination for many contemporary jewelers and artists. It all began with a forbidden romance. When the young Prince of Wales, later George IV, fell in love with the beautiful commoner, the twice widowed and Catholic Maria Fitzherbert. The Royal Marriage Act forbade the prince to marry without his father's consent, and King George III, the king at the time of the American independence, by the way, would be extremely unlikely to approve of such a marriage. In despair, the prince staged a suicide, after which Maria consented to a secret marriage, which would, of course, be invalid in English law. And so Maria had second thoughts. However, the prince's love did not fade, and he proposed again, begging Maria to return to him. There's a little fragment of from one of his letters that explains these pieces beautifully. He writes, P.S. I send you a parcel, and I send you at the same time an eye. If you have not totally forgotten the whole countenance, I think the likeness will strike you. Moved by this, Maria and Prince George were secretly married. Soon after this clandestine wedding, Maria commissioned a portrait of her own eye as a gift for the prince. This romantic exchange of eye portraits set off a passionate but short-lived trend which spread across Europe, and the object today is known as, again, as the lover's eye. The eye is one of the oldest and most powerful symbols used by humans. Eyes have commonly been called the windows to the soul. In some cultures, eyes ward off evil spirits. When the 18th century eye miniatures, the eye is not only watching, but looking back at the viewer, creating a unique connection and an intimate realm of space where they can join. Always returning the gaze, the eyes become a receiver and transmitter. The late 18th century as a whole was a visual culture obsessed with seeing and being seen, seeing without being seen. Playful gazes were practiced in arenas such as the opera box and the mall, and flirting. A great deal of flirting was done by these very suggestive eye gestures. So it was, again, a way of conveying a lot of information. Portrait of a loved one's gaze. As a portrait of the loved one's gaze, the eye miniatures were intended to capture the window into the soul of either a present or a lost loved one. They were rendered in watercolor on ivory or vellum. The eyes were generally covered with glass. They range in size from 1/2 inch to about 2 inches, creating an intimate object. The only details were eyelashes and eyebrows that hinted but did not reveal the identity of the owner of the eye. You could very seldom tell exactly whose eye was being portrayed, but the owner of the eye jewelry certainly did know, and it might have been sent to that person by an admirer, and only he or she, the recipient of the eye jewelry, actually knew who it was. So there was a certain kind of subterfuge in the whole thing. And they were set magnificently. The settings were an astonishing array of decorative and functional objects: watch fobs, snuff boxes, brooches, bracelets, rings, you name it. Anything like that could contain the eye miniature and could be worn, or could be secreted away in a pocket or some other place where only you, the recipient, the owner, would have access. These exquisitely set pieces were perfect foils for the simplicity of the eye. The eye, that very simple and lovely physiological part of the body, was encased in this over-the-top, sometimes, use of diamonds and pearls and gold and engraving and all kinds of elaborate sorts of settings. Men also wore these, of course, but men did not wear long draping necklaces or elaborate rings or bracelets. Their possessions were much simpler at this time, and so their eye miniatures were frequently encased in snuff boxes or little wallets or some kind of small thing that could be tucked away in their pockets, and when opened up, they would have the discreet pleasure of looking in this loved one's eye. Gems were used lavishly, and there became a language of gems, just like there was a language of flowers. Pearls were a great favorite. Pearls could stand for many things. They could stand for purity, innocence, humility. They could be a metaphor for heaven. But many times they were also used to represent tears. There was an association between the sea and salt water and tears and pearls. Diamonds, of course, denoted strength and longevity. And garnets were used a lot. Anybody who looks at a lot of antique jewelry knows how much garnet jewelry, particularly from the 19th, early 20th centuries, is available. Garnets were used to symbolize friendship and constancy. Garnet jewelry was often exchanged by friends to symbolize their close and everlasting relationship. Also, garnets were very affordable, and so many people could afford garnets who could not afford diamonds, and they were considered attractive for all complexions. So your garnet jewelry would look beautiful on you, blonde, brunette, whatever you were. The garnet jewelry would offset your complexion. Again, hair work. I come back to hair work. It's so fascinating as a material and as a highly symbolic metaphor for standing for the person and standing for a number of other attributes of human beings. As previously stated, human hair survives death and time. When combined with eye miniatures, the hair was often hidden in secret compartments. So in some of these, you can see the hair as being in the back of a ring, maybe in the back of a little locket. There was a tiny little opening and a bit of hair would be there. And the one on the upper left-hand side, however, has hair braided in a kind of a wonderful frame. So hair work continued its enormous popularity all through the Victorian era. The eye was often used in mourning jewelry. And when the eye was used in mourning jewelry, blue sky and clouds were frequently painted around or within the eye. Those blue clouds or the blue sky and the clouds signified that the person had passed into heaven. Here, the use of pearls signified tears. And the piece called The Crying Eye, you can see a tiny, tiny pearl in there within the brooch itself, showing a little tear surrounded by pearls, which signified also tears. So these, again, were very powerful symbols of mourning. There wasn't a lot of use of enamel prior to this period, to the 19th century, but there was a British jeweler who invented or developed a royal blue enamel that became wildly popular. So after this, after the, say, middle of the 19th century, enamel jewelry became much more popular, particularly this blue. This is a scene from a contemporary film. It's a scene from the TV series Outlander. It features an outrageously outsized lover's eye on the costume of the actress. The costume designer did the necessary homework here. The designer was aware of the hidden messages in eye jewelry, especially the fact that the owner of the eye is known only to the characters themselves. So the woman here is wearing a piece of eye jewelry that was much huger than anything from the 18th or 19th century. But you needed to get the point in the film that she was carrying a symbol that you didn't really know if this was her husband or her lover. Only she knows. So that bit of information needed to be conveyed to the viewer of the film quickly. So hence this wonderfully outsized piece of eye jewelry. Now I want to talk about three contemporary jewelers that use old references for their new work. And the contemporary jewelers are enamelist Jessica Calderwood, jeweler and enamelist Barbara McFadyen, and jeweler and enamelist Keith Lewis. In the first image here, in this group of eye jewelry images, we have a gaze with an attitude. Jessica Calderwood works with a much more modern gaze. This is not the morning gaze. This is not that gaze that you would find in the late 18th, early 19th century eye jewelry. These eyes convey a lot more information that would not have been even considered in that earlier jewelry. These eyes contain attitude, and they contain information and messages that would be unseemly in that earlier era. This is what I would call the modern gaze. Here, the gaze is looking askance, not looking at you. You're not exchanging a gaze with this, but this gaze is almost looking away in an almost mocking sort of way. And this wonderful piece allows you to be in communication with the eye, with the gaze, or not. You flip it over. It has a little mechanism working. You can flip the eye over, and the eye can be closed, and that gaze can be turned off. Again, a totally modern idea. Another one, I can view you or not, depending upon whether you turn me over. And in these pieces, you can see there's a little bit more anatomical fidelity. There's the characteristics of the eye are much more like almost like a medical illustration than those very romanticized eye pieces from the late 18th, early 19th century. A different way of looking at the eye completely from the old communication with the lover. This is a different kind of communication. Here we have a steely gaze with the eye being almost a target with those little gold squares leading up to it. Here are our eyes again, looking up, looking bored, looking with attitude. These eyes reveal a bit more physical characteristics. They're not as idealized. They're a little bit more anatomically correct in a way that is a much more modern kind of attitude. Now, this group of jewelry pieces I call the tender gaze. They're eye and memorial jewelry by Barbara McFadyen. And Barbara, again, was the artist that came up with a number of the earlier images and the earlier research because of her needing to create pieces that helped her deal with the deaths and the tragedy in her life at the time. This piece depicts Barbara's own eye, created with a handmade decal on the front with a portion of a personal handwritten message on the back. It's a gift to a dear friend. That eye in the front is no longer a little painting, but it's a decal. Again, a very, very modern kind of technology. She's working with photography and she's working with reproduction methods that were completely unknown in the 18th and early 19th century. The eye is similar, but the mechanics of reproduction here are quite different. Here she has another brooch with a personal message of love on the reverse. She's suggesting flowers and hearts and other kinds of traditional symbolism for love and loss in this, but it's much more simplified, stylized, and much more modern looking. Here's a locket to hold treasured small things. Perhaps hair, if this were consistent with the earlier Georgian and Victorian jewelry, it might contain hair. But maybe it contains some other kind of contraband. Who knows? This is the modern woman. Inside is an enameled royal blue secret compartment, making reference to the importance of blue enamel in that Victorian period. Here is a necklace with a knowing eye and a night moth. The night moth is the symbol of the need to trust one's own intuitions. These again are decals. These are made from a photographic process. They're not delicately painted little miniatures. These are using very 20th and 21st century technology in order to create that old sort of feeling. So you have the mix of the old and the new in this work. Here she uses the weeping willow symbolism. Again, the weeping willow with the leaves that drop down. They look like they're crying. They're in mourning. So she's showing us a weeping willow. However, she has laser etched it on an enamel surface. Laser etching was certainly not known in the Georgian or the Victorian era, but it has a similar kind of a sepia tone to it in this piece. So it's again a combination of old and new. And the other new thing on this brooch is the upright willow buds. So the weeping willow, but yet there's a symbol, there's a feeling of hope. There's an upright, there is a hope in the midst of sorrow kind of feeling in this piece that is unique. These following few pieces are tributes and remembrances to Barbara's mother. Here we see a figure in heavy shadow. The brown enamel on top has a silhouette of her mother as a young woman. The Japanese lantern forms signify hope and protection. There's a lot of floral content in these pieces. Again, Barbara has gone back to the dictionary, the Encyclopedia of Floral Imagery, and has chosen to depict and to explain a number of feelings and feelings with flowers or floral forms. Here, the rose and thorn shows that same silhouette of her mother amidst her favorite flower, the rose. The top pierced layer of blackened metal casts a somber mood over the piece, almost as if she is trapped behind something. There's a shadow of her in the front, trapped behind all this complicated foliage, and the black shadow in the back. It works very much like that silhouette jewelry from Georgian times. Here is a piece in progress, again containing the kinds of colors and elements one would find in that traditional mourning jewelry. Here's a photograph of Barbara's mother with an automobile showing you the vintage of the photograph. Another photograph shows a very young woman and pages of a letter. It composes a group of keepsakes that have a special poignancy as they suggest a young and optimistic woman who has not yet suffered the pain and disappointments of age. It's a different kind of mourning that Barbara is discussing here. It's mourning of a mother who has lived for a very long age and who's gone through a lot of 20th century history, and Barbara is commenting on and memorializing some of the things that her mother experienced in her life. Here's a photo of Barbara's mother, again, as a very young woman. In addition, here's a photo of her in a period bathing suit. More suggestions of a long ago youth looking optimistically into the future, perhaps the future that never ever materialized. And here is an eye miniature depicting Barbara's mother, far away and long ago gaze, along with falling leaves and branches. Here we have some plaited hair under a rose silhouette with a black onyx heart. These are all symbolisms that you have seen in previous eras, especially the plaited hair. The plaited hair, the rose, the heart, the black, all of these things have become common vocabulary in our understanding of mourning and mourning jewelry. We can read it easily. Here's an essay on the loved and lost, which was inspired by Georgian profile portraits. 2 layers of enamel are sandwiched inside a Victorian-inspired frame. A laser-etched enamel makes the back layer a silhouette overlaid by fragments from a letter. Again, laser engraving, certainly not known in Victorian or Georgian times, but new technology expressing age-old sentiment. Cherish is the name for a word that occurs in a letter fragment etched over a field of shadowy silhouettes. It's modeled after a 19th century bracelet given to a daughter by her mother. The figures are framed by an oval based on an elaborate Victorian ivory brooch, and the wire work suggests unbroken links. Another portrait of a young woman, not a care in the world, accompanied by friends. How long did this moment last? And here's that same young girl that we saw in the last image against a field of roses. The moment has long passed in the woman's life, but these locking links suggest an unbroken connection past to future. And the black jet beads and the flowers and the color, again, all of that vocabulary of traditional mourning jewelry, telling a personalized, very modern tale. Now, my last group of images are pieces by jeweler, enamelist, and metalsmith Keith Lewis. I find these unique in their form. They have certain aspects of Victorian and Edwardian, or Victorian and Georgian mourning jewelry, but they're very different. They connote a different time and a different kind of mourning. The unique memorial jewelry of Keith Lewis are new forms for a new epidemic. Unknown until the 1980s by most people, the AIDS epidemic contained a lot of misinformation and a lot of grief, a lot of fear, and a lot of loss of people that were young and in the prime of lives, and frequently young people who were on the brink of important and creative careers. So these pieces reinvent a genre. It's less sentimental, more in your face. This was not a good death. AIDS was not a good death as it was understood in the 18th and 19th centuries. This was a new crisis. A new crisis, again, demands new forms. I'm going to read a little bit of Keith's own writings about these pieces. Keith is a very articulate writer and a very poignant writer, and so I'm going to just paraphrase and read from some of his text. This piece is called Dead Souls. I quote Keith. In one of his parables, Georges Louis Bourges talks about the doubleness of death, not just the actual death, but the death of the memory of the dead. So much disappeared from the world with the loss of our comrades in love, and those of us that were left, that were spared by the virus, that were lucky enough to survive into the time of treatments, carry the obligations of memory. And here's a close-up of one of the elements in 35 Dead Souls. And you can see in the back a replication of the AIDS virus captured in plastic. Because of its deep history as an aid to mourning and in remembrance of lost friends and the possible death of my tribe, I remembered jewelry and decided to use it as a vessel in the hopes of pushing memory past my time. Again, I'm quoting from Keith and his writings about these pieces. I made portraits of some of those that I had known. Chris McManus used mortician's makeup to inadequately cover the lesions of Kaposi sarcoma. Bob Ford, an architect and my landlord, comforted me one time when I feared infection, though he himself was dying. In his cat-like grace, he presents a diagram of the virus. My fellow activist soldier, Peter, went down fighting, organizing, marching, and agitating until he was entirely consumed. His rage was incandescent and still lights the way. In self-portraits, thinking of Borges, I nurtured the spark of memory. The virus cost Randy Johnson the use of his arms and legs before it took his life, and I wish I had traveled to Boston to hug him before he was gone. Doug Dismoni, sweet, sexy, loyal Doug, the best friend with benefits that I ever had. Of course, this virus did not affect just my little world. It spread around the globe and killed millions. But I've tried to tell the story that I know. Despite the virus, we went on, living in bodies and knowing pleasure. Now, this is a set of memorials of a different sort. And when I saw these pieces, I immediately recognized them as a kind of mourning jewelry. But rather than mourning an individual, they mourn a family, an entire era, a situation, a scenario. And these are pieces from his group of work called The Saddest Isle. Using the forms and language of memorial jewelry to speak about things past and discarded. These thrift store items are meant to stand in for lost times, time passing, even mortality. In the U.S., we have many thrift stores, places where people donate unwanted things, ostensibly for charity. And of course, being defined by shopping, we buy back almost as much as we give. So the objects in these stories are progressively narrowed down by desire or hopes of utility until only the most unlovable things remain. And in his group here, these baskets remain in the thrift store. The most melancholy of these items are abandoned baskets, which gather together in what I call the saddest aisle. These rejected vessels were witnesses to the most intimate secrets of their former homes. They have memories which cannot be recovered, but which has filled them full of sorrow and weariness. When I find them, these baskets are dusty and forlorn, utterly abject. They held gifts of soap, fading potpourri, warm bread from that final holiday before Father left for good. They offered themselves to romantic picnics. They held keys or had bright nylon ribbons tied to their handles. They cradled precious jars of National Park huckleberry jam, bought in a burst of optimism for the future. Despite knowing what they know, despite all they have done, they are abandoned and shunned. In the saddest aisle, they huddled together, yearning for a new home. They silently received and took unto themselves everything they were called to witness. Now, I want to hesitate right here and talk a little bit about the technique. These are fragments of old baskets that are purchased from thrift stores. They're cut up. They are encased in a electroconductive surface, and then they are electroformed, which means that copper is grown over them. So they become reproduced, as if you will, in copper. And on them, on those wonderful reproduced copper fragments of baskets, Keith has indicated ribbons and jewels, tying them up in the sort of festive ways that not only commemorate their early lives, but also address traditional forms of mourning jewelry. So here it's electroformed copper, enamel, and pearls, with colors and jewels and surfaces very reminiscent of traditional mourning jewelry. The pieces are almost always a pin or some kind of a jewel. And I'll end with a much more traditional form of Keith's jewelry, the ossuary pin. In here, he returns to the ovals, the skulls, the skeletons of very, very early morning jewelry, with a little bit of a difference, as you can see on the lower right-hand side. There is still evidence of a healthy body in this ossuary piece. And death shall have no dominion. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I hope I've helped with a little bit of an appreciation of these marvelous, wonderful jewelry forms that have spoken so eloquently through the ages, but especially how contemporary modern jewelers use this vocabulary, use these forms to convey ideas that are more involved in modern life. Thank you very much.